All right, welcome. My name is Mary Hess. I'm on the faculty of Luther Seminary. I want to welcome you to this introduction to restorative justice. On behalf of Invite, which is integrating nonviolence into theological education, we're a group at Luther, and then Interfaith Action here locally. I want to begin briefly with Luther's land acknowledgement. Let me just pull that up in front of me. So Luther Seminary is on Minnesota Makoche, the homelands of the Dakota Oyate, the Ojibwe, Ho-Chunk, Cheyenne, Oto, Iowa, and the Sac and Fox also inhabited Minnesota land. We recognize that God calls all to be in right relationship with their neighbors, that the tribes are sovereign nations, that there is a history of broken treaties and broken trust, and that there's much reconciling work to be done. As Christians, we also recognize that in Christ there is new life, forgiveness, and hope for mending what is broken. We pray that the Holy Spirit will lead us in this work. And I invite you now just into a moment of silence to pay attention to your breath, to recognize transcendence if you are someone for whom that is part of your practice. And we'll just be quiet for a moment. Take a nice deep breath in and let it out as we all breathe together. So again, welcome. I invite you to put your name and where you're coming from or anything else you want to introduce yourself in the chat. We're going to be using the chat throughout our time together. If a colleague, Sandy, and I are going to be monitoring it to try to lift up questions if they need to be lifted up at the moment, but also to keep track of questions when we get to the Q&A part of our time together. I want to emphasize that we are doing this as part of the Twin Cities Nonviolent, 10 Days of Nonviolent. And this is a very little introduction. It's a very basic, let's just learn just a little bit about what restorative justice might be being here in the Twin Cities. And so I hope it will give you a taste and maybe catalyze your imagination, but there will be much more to come. So please, this is not going to answer all your questions by a long shot. And towards the end, we may do a little vision casting about what might even be emerging. We have 3 speakers with us today, and I'm just so pleased and grateful that they were willing to join us. Brenda Burnside is the CEO of Let's Circle Up Restorative Services. She's a restorative justice trainer, practitioner, circle keeper, community advocate for reimagining justice for the Youth Collaborative Review Team. I'm probably saying that wrong. Brenda, you can help me when you are up. Annie Kahn is Assistant County Attorney in the Pretrial Justice Division in the Office of the Ramsey County Attorney John Choi. And Randy Roth is the Executive Director of Interfaith Action and a former longtime civil legal services lawyer. Our plan for today is to have each of them speak briefly and then to have them engage each other in questions, and then to open up the Zoom room to all of you. So if I may, Brenda, you're on.
I get to start. Yay me. So my name is Brenda Burnside. I am a circle keeper. I am an advocate for restorative justice, and my work actually began in the school system. And when I began in the school system in special education, one of the biggest things that I noticed were the inequities that exist, right? And I thought to myself, how do we begin to level that playing field when the inequities exist? And restorative justice was some of the answers that the district came up with and asked me to participate. So at that point, I started my journey into restorative practices. And we call it a practice because it's something that becomes a lifestyle and something that we do continuously. It's never a one and done. So in that, I was able to do my work in the school system to bring about a system of understanding each other through our values and through storytelling and through sharing our perspectives and our backgrounds, and just looking at overall the humanity that we connect with. Even when our experiences are not the same, that we connect at the level of humanity. So that's who I am. I now do my work with the collaborative review team, and Annie also works with John Choi, but this was a vision of John Choi's to work with reimagining what justice looks like for youth. And on that team, I serve with a representative from the prosecutor's office, from Annie's office, a person from the public defender's office, and then I am the community member on that team, hopefully to bring about perspective and stories that we don't hear, that we can't get on the page from the police report or from the incident report that happened. So that's what we do. We talk about the lives of the families that come to us, and that kind of work. So we do that day to day, and some of that'll come out also in our discussion. But the work that we try to do is just in restorative justice, trying to heal brokenness, broken communities, broken families, broken people, how we kind of shift from seeing them as crime and punishment to looking at their situations in terms of what are the harms and what are the needs? How do we meet the needs so that people don't feel they have to harm people or harm communities to get the things that they need? So that kind of is in a nutshell. I think, I don't know if I was just supposed to introduce myself. If I did, I'm way over. So sorry, you guys.
No, actually, you can introduce yourself, but you can say you can have up to 7 minutes. So if you want to keep going, Brenda, feel free, or we can go on.
Well, I'd love to keep going on the restorative justice, but one of the things that I will share is a definition from Kay Prentice that is actually noted in Fania Davis's book on restorative justice. And it says that restorative justice is a justice that seeks not to punish, but to heal. A justice about not getting even, but about getting well. A justice that seeks to heal broken lives, relationships, and communities rather than shatter them further. A justice that seeks reconciliation rather than the deepening of conflict. A healing justice rather than a harming one. And that's one of the great definitions that I try to use over and over again so that people kind of understand what we're doing when we do this restorative justice. It's not just about letting somebody off. It's not just about, like finding something to do with people. It's actually trying to heal communities. And my particular definition that I use often is seeking the humanity in everyone and prioritizing it above their actions. And I use that often because we are looking at humanity. We are looking at people who are broken and who don't know what to do with that brokenness, and offering them opportunities and access that our system traditionally has kept them out of, right? And I look at the numbers, and 95 to 97% of those referrals are African-American families. And when I look at that, it tells me that there are some needs there that are not being met. That's not by accident that looks that way, right? The communities that are, least serviced or, who have the least opportunities are the ones who usually end up in that system, right? And then even when they end up in the system, how do we treat them, right? Do we treat them with dignity and respect? There are some communities that we work with, and they have never really been treated with the respect that we know as people. In this country, people who are poor, people who are minority, they are not treated well. Let's not be confused about that. When I go into a business and people see my dark skin, I'm not always treated with the respect initially that everyone is or that I deserve, right? And then maybe when I speak up and try to say I'm somebody else, or I'm somebody different, or I have this or I have that behind my name, then I get a little more respect. But the thing is that I'm the same human being underneath. Why could you not see my humanity? Why could you not look beyond my skin and see the humanity? Right. So and just ask me, what do I need? Right. You're in a service position. You're providing me customer service. I'm a customer. So where does that service begin? And where does it end, depending on your, your station in life or your skin color? So anyway, I don't know. I think I'm at my 7 minutes. So Mary, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And now I'm going to invite Annie Kahn to chime in.
Thanks, Mary. I'm glad to be here today. I know that you had asked John Choi, who is our county attorney and my boss, and he is at a conference out of town. But restorative justice is something that's hugely important to him and something he's been talking about since he started at the county. And I was one of the first people he hired. So I've had an opportunity to hear the evolution of how he's thought about restorative practice along with my own evolution. So I have been a prosecutor my whole career as a lawyer, and I started my career as a prosecutor. I was briefly in what we then called the juvenile delinquency division, and then I spent a significant amount of time in the adult trial division, where I tried robberies and burglaries and thefts and homicides and domestic assaults and all those other kinds of things. And after doing that for about 5 years, I had the opportunity to start working with some non-traditional court responses. So I started working at that point with things that are now known as treatment courts. Areas of the system that were attempting to respond in a way that the traditional system did not. And I think that's because people across the board were frustrated and continue to be frustrated at the lack of any real successful outcomes from the traditional system. That it wasn't making people happy who thought people should be locked up away forever, because it doesn't do that. And it wasn't making people happy who thought, who were approaching this from a much broader perspective of things like repairing harm, because it doesn't do that. And it also doesn't see, like as Brenda said, doesn't see the humanity in people. And in many ways is an opportunity to cause additional harm as opposed to repair that harm. So I spent a while in the treatment courts, where that's really a different kind of system response. It's a different response, but it is still very much a system response that involves a judge and all of the players that are in the traditional system. And after doing that for a while, John asked me to come work in a different division and start focusing more on diversion. Diversion means a lot of things, but the main idea is that you're sending people out of the system in diversion, as opposed to keeping them in the system. So in the time we've been doing that, we have a kind of a traditional diversion system, which includes case management and is kind of still a system response, but a much lighter touch, and a response that's designed to not pull people into the system, but try and return more of the case to community responses. But that's what John calls, that's an off-ramp from the system. So you're already kind of on the system, that's an off-ramp. And one of the things that he has been pushing, and that we as an office have been looking to do, and this is starting to become mixed metaphors, but start farther upstream. Instead of thinking, how are we going to be an off-ramp? How are we going to help shrink our footprint, which is important to the leadership in our office, that we're not just bringing more and more things into the system. How are we going to send things off, but how are we going to be how are we going to use our role as prosecutors? What is our role as prosecutors in going back farther and not ever having people in the system to begin with? So there's some textual support for that. The Minnesota Rules of Professional Responsibility tell prosecutors a prosecutor has the responsibility of a minister of justice and not simply that of an advocate. That is supposed to be in the forefront of the work that we do. The National District Attorneys Association says that the prosecution about the prosecution function, that the primary responsibility of prosecution is to see that justice is accomplished. And that regarding charging, the prosecutor should exercise discretion to file only those charges which he or she considers to be consistent with the interests of justice. So what is justice is a big question, but that's a question that we can and should debate forever. But the support is there that we are not one role. We should be continuing to engage in this process. So that's very much something that matters to John. Brenda described some of the work. Brenda's on the team of people who works in our office in the Youth Justice and Wellness Division, who are part of what I think is kind of a revolutionary case review reimagining of the system. The idea that instead of our office holding all of that power and decision making at the time in which you're deciding, is this case going to be something that we bring into the system or is it not? Bringing in community and a public defender into that role to staff that decision in a collaborative meeting where my understanding is it's a consensus-based meeting and that the group is almost always able to come to a consensus, and very frequently that's to send the case for community-based services as opposed to into the system. So for the past few years, I think that started several years ago in my office, the planning for that big initiative to start kind of systemically changing the way that cases are reviewed and what outcomes we're recommending. That process started, I think, about 3.5 years ago and started being implemented about 1 year ago. And that I think that process is both, it both refers children to a lot of restorative circle-based programming and restorative conferencing, but it's also collaborative, and I would describe it as more restorative in the process itself. So that is something that I think was an important goal in the reimagining of how that process works entirely. And if Brenda has thoughts she wants to add in on that, feel free to jump in at any time, Brenda. A huge portion, a big portion of the cases that come in for review in the juvenile side now go through that process. They all get a preliminary review to make sure that it's the type of case that we can legally pursue, because that's a threshold question for us. We shouldn't be involved in cases that aren't that we can't legally pursue. But of the cases that get that threshold review, I think almost half of them have gone through that collaborative process. So it's really a big portion of the youth work.
And I will add here, Annie, that when we discuss the cases, it's not from a lawyer brain, right? It is, you know what, has this kid been through adoption? Do they have housing stability? We find out what is the race of the kid, what is the age of that particular child? What does brain development say about how they will respond the next time? We look at what communities they live in or have come from. We look at if they are in transitional housing. There are a few units around the city that have transitional housing. We take all of that into consideration. We also take into consideration the capacity of the parents. right? If the kid has been through Rule 20, which means are they even capable to stand, try or to be in court? Are they able to sit in circle? What are their disabilities? If they have IEPs, are they involved in their school counseling? Are they involved in any kind of county mental health issues, or any facilities? Those kinds of things are the things that we consider on the CRT, which is not always taken into consideration when, the police reports come in. Usually there's another story. And my job as a community person on the team is to go out and get that story if it doesn't make sense to us, right? If it doesn't sound right and something is not adding up, I reach out to the family and I say, what happened? This doesn't make any sense to us. Can you fill in the blanks some here? So then that's when we get the stories. That's usually when we find out the kid, has fetal alcohol syndrome or something like that. Or that's when we find out that they're responding to some kind of stimuli in their environment, So those are the kinds of things that we do on the CRT that brings about that people centering, that humanity piece that doesn't live in the story on the page. Sorry, Anne.
Can I take a moment and just say, Brenda, can you explain, you've used the term a lot, and I think there might be some people here who don't know what it is, circle keeping and circle practice?
So yeah, circle keeping and circle practice really is, okay, so restorative justice is like an umbrella and circle keeping is only one piece of that, right? So the practice is that our mindset is right for being restorative, meaning we're challenging ourselves regarding traditional punitive measures. We're asking ourselves, do those things serve us well? Where did they start? Where did they come from? Like, I ask people often when I'm, addressing their whole idea of the penal system, do you know when it first started? Do you know what the first purpose of it was, right? So, when we get to the fact that the police were started to, return, runaway slaves to their masters and things like that, let's find out now, do we now repurpose that so that it serves our purposes now? Do we, to serve us well? Okay, so that's the start. So then when we look at the whole practice of it, when we sit in circle, the circle is about monitoring agreements so that we can have an honest, brave conversation about what happened. How did we get to this space? And one of the questions that I like to ask people constantly is to think about, did we inherit the problem or are we producing it? Do we continue to perpetuate these problems, or did we inherit a problem that we're trying to eradicate? Because sometimes it seems to me that we, through our actions, usually unknowing, because of that mindset that's been instilled in us, unknowingly, we reproduce the situation that we say we're trying to eradicate. So restorative practices holds a space for us to heal, for us to reflect, for us to actually grapple with what justice looks like Annie was saying. And like Bell Hooks talks about justice, and he said, justice demands integrity. It's to have a moral universe, not only what's right and wrong, but to put things in perspective, right? Because our stories are so varied that, sometimes we have to look at it from 2 or 3 or 5 different ways to get the real story, right? And I tell people all the time, when you are thinking about reality, when people tell their stories, they tell them from their perspective with all of their feelings, their experiences, and their background mixed in. So when I talk, like my sister tells stories about our family, very different from the way I do, right? I saw it I said, were you at the same place with me? I'm like, no way that happened, right? And sometimes people are still stuck in the 13-year-old version of that story, right? But now I'm looking at it as an adult and I'm like, no, I get it, right? So that's what, we have to grapple with things. Does it make sense to us now? You know what I mean? So at 13, the things that I was doing don't make any sense to me now. like with the way I was raised, when we went to church, we were like all suited up. I'm from Chicago. So, we had to wear our Sunday dresses and the poofy things and the crinoline that itches, and all of that kind of thing. Well, now, am I going to put myself through that torture? No, I'm not even going to put my kids through it. I thought about it, but I'm not going to do that. So I just say to myself, those things don't make any sense anymore. And the same way, some of our thoughts and things that we grew up with don't make any sense. It's not valid for now. Some of it is because even the word shalom means right relationship. It talks about peace and how we live together. So what is that right relationship? I don't think we can necessarily get there through white supremacy. I don't think necessarily that we can get through that, but I listen to everybody's perspective because everybody's words are valid, right? Everybody's story is valid and it's real to them. So that's the thing that I think we have to think about. Justice is very complex. And how do we level that out for a kid who has been subjected to things that, are in no way their fault, but now they've learned a habitual way of life that may, impact the rest of their lives. So how do we interrupt that pattern and show them something different, right? Without judgment, without, all of that extra stuff that we throw in, that makes people feel bad and makes people think badly of themselves, which is never a good outcome. So anyway, I hope that answers your question, Mary. I know I get so wrapped up.
Amen. I was going to say amen, amen, and amen. Annie, did you want to say anything else before I throw it over to Randy?
Only if you have time, I can share a little bit about the work that's not happening in youth justice. Because we have this arbitrary line between people who are 17 and people who are 18. And I think everyone on this call knows that you don't immediately become a grown-up at age 18 or at any other age. But there is an arbitrary line in the system. So the youth justice work is the work that Brenda is involved in that we've been describing. But that doesn't mean that work is just as important in the adult area, where typically we're working with young adults, and all of the research shows that the brain is still in development, and that for all intents and purposes, people are still youth and growing when they are 18 up until they are, I think, 25, which is coincidentally when people have their greatest interaction with the adult legal system. And that's not a coincidence. So in the same way with the work on the youth justice side, we need to transform the way we respond, as opposed to escalating punishment in an attempt to deter behavior, because that doesn't work. And there is plenty of research that shows that escalating punishment does not deter behavior. And it is still, unfortunately, the foundation of the traditional system. And it's still, unfortunately, the frequently only answer, especially for serious cases. So there's a huge amount of work to be done across the board. But the work that is in many ways easiest to pick up is the lower end of that. I hope that someday we will be incorporating restorative practices in all levels. And in fact, my office has done some of that, including up to and including homicide cases. It gets more and more mired in the legal issues as a case becomes more serious, but also it becomes more and more impactful. And I know that people who do restorative work in the criminal context talk about how a lot of prosecutors kind of envision this for cases they don't care about, as opposed to what restorative work is really the strongest at, which is healing the greatest harms. There's only room to go up in this context. But one of the areas I wanted to talk about is when George Floyd was murdered. I think anyone in this community, anyone mostly in the country, took a lot of stock of what their role was in the system. And as a prosecutor, I know that many of my colleagues and I had a huge kind of assessment of what we were doing and what we could be doing. And we ended up sending many of the felony level cases that came out of protests, most of which were damage related cases, to restorative circles. It is sometimes hard to know, entrenched in a system, where to start. And that seemed like a focal point. We can do something here. We can take some of these cases and we can send these cases to some community discussions. And I got to sit in on, or I should say participate, Brenda. I was participating in that circle process, not sitting in on it. And I got to sit in on some of those circles where there was one in particular where we had a assistant manager from a Walgreens store and a woman who had been part of a group who had broken in, and they were actually breaking into the pharmacy area. And that's a pretty serious offense as far as property offenses go. And this was a young woman who wanted to participate in the circle. Walgreens wanted to participate. And we found ourselves having a discussion that really revolved around everyone in the circle's experience with substance use. The assistant manager, the woman who had been part of the group, both talked about that. The woman who had been part of the group talked about her chronic pain. And I say this is a young woman, so that she had a lot of insight into the things that brought her there, into the community issues that brought her there, and into her own personal issues that brought her there. And hearing this assistant manager talk through her experiences with substance use and abuse was a huge piece of connection for the two of them, and for the other people involved in the circle as well, who could share those experiences. Hearing that young woman not only talk about that, but talk about her vision as this was an incident that was not harming anyone except corporate interests, and having the Walgreens assistant manager talking about her frantically trying to find shifts for her employees who this was their work, this is what they were relying on, and she was trying to fit them into other Walgreens locations so that they wouldn't lose their regular work, because these employees are people in the community who are typically lower wage employees, and who missing shifts was a huge deal for, and kind of communicating what it was like to go into the place you work every day and to sweep up the broken glass and to try and deal with that, and communicating the emotions that it felt to go into that situation as the young woman. So, that's an experience that you cannot replicate in the traditional system. Not even if you want to. If there's no place to replicate that experience. And in many cases, that in and of itself, even if you do nothing else, that experience reaches that new way to respond to a harm, and to transforming how we're responding to a harm, and to imagining what we want to come out of that incident, and how we could repair it, how we could be part of it, and how as prosecutors we could either direct or encourage that repairing of the harm, is something that we want to build out from our system. More and more I hear from people within my office and without systems partners even, wouldn't this be, instead of doing X, Y, and Z, instead of doing a weekend in jail or community work service, what if the response was actually with the people who were harmed or with the community who can talk about what this harm feels like? And the issue now is just broader implementation.
Wow, thank you. That's an incredibly powerful story. And it matches what I've heard from other circles as well. Randy, I want to bring you in now, and maybe you can talk a little bit about what Interfaith Action is trying to help support. I mean, I think you used the word earlier, vision casting. So maybe you could say a little bit about that, and we'll let the three of you together, if you want to talk to each other, but I'm going to call it at 1:15 so we can get other questions from the group. So, Randy.
Thank you, Mary. I'd like to open by saying what a privilege it is to have this panel in this introduction to restorative justice. I think that we all recognize that we're in a time, we've reached a moment in time where we're all searching for that right relationship that Brenda touched on when she was speaking and talked about the meaning of shalom. And we look around at the structures in our society and see they just don't align. And when I've had the privilege of working with Brenda and Annie for a few years now, and when I hear them speak about the work and the why, for me personally, it's a tuning fork. It's like, yes, this is where we need to be aligning. And I'll just take a tiny moment of personal privilege and say this is the beginning of the Jewish high holidays. And we listen a few times to the clarion call of the shofar, the blowing of a ram's horn. And that's how this feels when I hear it. Again, speaking just for myself. So for us to have a Ramsey County attorney, John Choi, and a really excellent staff supporting the Ramsey County attorney with a vision of making this a reality with all the obstacles that presents and all the dangers that presents is an extraordinary thing. And that we have a practitioner in our community with the depth and knowledge and experience and compassion and rootedness of Brenda, that's an extraordinary thing. And that they're together, we're in an opportunity moment here. And I just want to start by calling that out. Second, I'm just going to give you 1 minute of my bio. I'm a lawyer, but have always practiced, except for law school clinic, have always practiced on the civil side. I've been a legal aid lawyer for most of my life, which means providing free legal services to low-income people. And I did that first in Chicago, where I grew up in really high-density public housing, and then for family farmers nationwide who live in poverty. And I worked in philanthropy some, and now I'm the executive director, like Mary said, of Interfaith Action of Greater St. Paul. We believe that opportunity grows and poverty recedes when people of faith invest themselves in effective action. And that's what we're talking about today. Mm-hmm. So how did we come to know Annie and Brenda and all this work? So one of the many areas, we're mostly known for running the shelter for families with minor children in Ramsey County, the largest shelter for running the Department of Indian work with many of the services for the American Indian community. But we do lots of other work too. And one thing we do is a clergy civic engagement series where we invite clergy locally and statewide to meet with elected officials and others about the pressing issues of the day. So Ramsey County Attorney John Choi was our guest, maybe 5 seconds before COVID hit. And he urged the clergy in that meeting to please put forward volunteers from their congregations who were willing to be trained in circle practice. He laid out that day, I have this vision. It's really far away before it's going to become reality. But if I have people in congregations who really understand this and know how to practice, and remember Brenda's definition of practice, right? About having checked their attitudes and being rooted in the right ways of thinking and right relationship, then I know I'm going to have a core, CORPS, like an army of people who I can join with to help make this vision a reality when the time comes. And so COVID hit, lockdown happened, churches closed, synagogues closed, but we used the time in that year or two on Zoom to engage Brenda and to train cohorts of faith community volunteers in circle practice. And so we have, I don't know, maybe about 80 or 85 people who've gone through, I would say, intensive training with Brenda. When I did it, I had 9 weeks of training with homework in between every week, and then practice circles. And so people have really familiarized themselves with the work. And the question becomes now, what work will they do? Some of them have been able to sit in circle on cases that were charged in the criminal justice system here. But beyond that, and in a second, I'm going to pivot the discussion by asking both Brenda and Annie to give us their visions for the future in this work. But so beyond the work on the individual cases, we're all talking about an idea of individual houses of worship or seminaries or other institutions having standing circles, having people who are trained, who really get it, who anyone who's experiencing any kind of difficulty, whether it's coming out of incarceration or divorce or cancer or whatever it is, to have a circle to come to in their own community for assistance. So I am going to stop there and throw back. I'm going to be trusting our facilitators to interrupt us if questions show up in the chat. But absent that, I'm going to throw first to Brenda and then to Annie about vision for the future.
Thank you, Randy. My vision definitely is to have circles in every community. And I am always willing to train people to sit in circle because I believe that that's the way we build communities and that's the way we build solutions into our communities. And I think it's a very unique opportunity to have faith-based communities that have their own people, their own spaces where they can do circles at any point. And one of the things that I kind of choose as a caveat to now doing trainings, it's not about money for me. It's all about building communities who can sit down and talk to each other. So I'm willing to train anyone. The thing that I want and I ask for people to do is sit down and have your own circles. After you are trained, do not hold it to yourself. Do not hold it. Go ahead and get started. Start with 2 or 3 people. Sometimes this movement happens at the kitchen table. You know, it's not always at the Capitol. It's not always, you know, and trust me, I'm there often. You know me by name, but, you know, it's not always there. The fight is sometimes right on your block, right? So let's sit down and have those circles. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for it to become a case. We can do this preventatively. When we meet people's needs, they don't have the need to go out and harm, right? So that's what I would say is my vision. If we could fill all of those 700 faith-based communities with spaces where we could have circle on a regular basis where people can come and have their needs met. I knew of a church in Chicago that actually had prayer on every block in their zip code every week, you know, and I was just thinking if we had circles every week on every block in our zip code, what couldn't we accomplish? So I don't want to take all the time. Annie?
Well, I love hearing your vision, Brenda. I think a big part of my vision and of John's vision is shrinking our footprint and recognizing that prosecutors with all of our training in prosecution are not necessarily the best people to innovate a system outside of the one we have. So I've, you know, some visions for what our role looks like going forward. But one of the things that I hope is that we have more and more community organizations to turn to say, you are the expert in this. You are the community here. This is something that you are capable of responding to. And there are models for that. There are a lot of different kinds of models for that, but there are models for that around the country. Organizations that are separate, not a subsection of the district attorney's office, but that are models for how that work can be done at the really serious end. And also this idea that there are standing community response services, that the community itself just has this this restorative response that is not just designed to respond to the criminal system, because we know that you can't just separate people's lives into this is the part that is the criminal piece and this is the part that's the non-criminal piece. Everybody's life is more complex than that. When we try to reduce people, and the system is so terrible at reducing people to one thing or another, we lose their humanity. And I think the fastest and most effective way to really change somebody's perspective is to help them see the humanity in a person. And one of the really stark ways that often happens, I think, for prosecutors is when they come to understand the people that they are working with not as victims and defendants, somebody who is a victim of harm and somebody who has caused the harm, but people who encompass both of those things, people who have experienced harm, people who have caused harm, people who come as a whole person and in a very complex situation. And the farther we get away from that paradigm, the easier it is to become part of that humanity and to want to work toward it. So I don't think it's a secret to say that there is sometimes pushback from law enforcement in this type of system reform work. So one of the visions that I have is because there's a lot of things that prosecutors aren't good at. And I don't think we should get in the practice of doing more things that we're not good at doing. But one thing that we do a lot is talk to law enforcement. So one of the things that I see as work that prosecutors can lead is helping reimagine the way law enforcement can be involved. I had a conversation with an officer on a case that was sent ultimately for a pre-charge restorative diversion referral. And I was talking to the officer about what some options that we had, and I wanted his input before I made a decision. And one of the options was traditional diversion. And I said, we could do a restorative process for this. And he said, I would love to sit in that, and I would rather that than whatever, the community work service hours or whatever you would ask them to do in the traditional system. I have a lot that I'd like to share. And that officer talked about how in the time since Philando Castile had been killed, he was one of the only officers who was still in his jurisdiction, in his department, and how he was an officer who identified as multiracial, and the complex situations that presented him, both with his colleagues, in his work, emotionally. And it really highlighted, when people are willing to be vulnerable, the conversations that you can have. So part of this work is, I think part of the role of prosecutors is engaging people who are already justice partners in the system and bringing that humanity, however we can, into the system farther.
I think you've maybe already answered this question, but it's such a good question. I'm going to lift it up again anyway. This comes from Gil Gustafson, and he said, could you speak to the impact of the restorative justice circle process on both those who have been harmed and those who caused harm?
Ooh, that is a great question. So in part of the CRT, the collaborative review team that I serve on, we collect statements from each one of the victims or the people harmed, as well as the stories of the people who do the harm. And it's interesting that some of the people actually say, I don't want them to go to jail. I don't want them to, have this or that. They say, you know what, I just want them to know, that they've impacted me, that life sucks for everybody, they said, and that we're all, doing the best we can, right? Some people actually, talk about what they had to go through. A lady went and told us, she said, I had to pay for an Uber during peak hours because my car wasn't available for me, right? And just things like that. About the process, but I think they also find out that they have the same needs. So let me tell you what I mean. I had a conversation with a young man in the workhouse, and he said, the hardest part of probation for me is going to be dealing with not carrying a weapon. He said, I have PTSD and I'm scared all the time. And I thought about the people who are out on the street, they're afraid of him. He's more afraid of them. He's afraid for his life. And, he can't even get through probation because, he's like this. He said, I'm going to have to stay in the house all the time. So that's 90 days of staying in the house, right? Not going out because I'm afraid, without having a gun on me. How do I protect myself? The same thing, they found out they have the same needs for safety, right? He thinks he's looking over his shoulder all the time, so I just look at those things when they happen in circle and when that humanity comes out, because there is no substitution for human interaction. I don't care what you say. I see it happen. I see people in these circles just melt, and it's because I got to see the face of and look in the eyes of a human being. Maybe they did something, right? But we're more than our actions. That's what makes us human. We're more than just what we do. And I carry one of my biggest talking pieces is a jumbo eraser. If I could erase all the things that I wish I hadn't done, all the stuff that I wish I could get rid of, that I could just detach from my name, So I just think about those things. But yes, everybody is impacted, but everyone heals. We don't heal by ourselves in a vacuum, right? So we heal together, hearing those stories and feeling that pain and being, impacted by what has affected other people as well. So anyway, great question. And yes, a lot of people are on board, but then there are many who say, lock them up, but cages don't heal.
So I'm going to lift up a comment somebody made, which wasn't a question, but I think there's a question we could ask about it. She wrote, this is Amy, I have neighbors who do not report crimes because they are concerned about what will happen to the youth or vulnerable adult perpetrator. Can you talk a little bit, any of you, about what are some things we could do to start building out more restorative circles so that people wouldn't either feel like they can't report something, but they don't know what else to do?
Well, I mean, I know what I do. Before I call anybody, I try to knock on the neighbor's door. I do. Like we have sometimes where we have parties, loud parties and things like that. Neighbors, don't want to say anything. And I remember one night I had on my pajamas and there was kind of a loudness going on across the street. And I know that the couple down the street puts their kids to bed at 7 o'clock. So I know they're not happy. I already know they're gritting their teeth and they're, and I yell out the window and I say, you guys are a little loud, because I didn't want to go outside, right? And I'm listening to all this and they've already called the police. The police showed up on the block and they're explaining it to the police. And I'm like, and when they were saying to the police, we're not even that loud. I said, no, yes, you guys are. I hear you. And I'm yelling out the window. So, but, try first, you know what I mean? Like there are some things we can do. Like if we have a relationship with people, if we actually come to the national nights out and we actually, are, like my neighbors, when we're giving out candy for Halloween, sometimes we sit outside, right? Sometimes we get to know each other. There's one of my neighbors who constantly reminds me if they say, I don't know if you've heard, we got snow emergency tonight. Take your car off the street. I'm like, okay, great. Thank you. So some things like that can happen when we know people, but when we don't, and we just sit in our houses and, hope for the best and look for the worst, it doesn't work. So that's my piece. I don't know what other people would suggest.
Yeah, I think, what Brenda's talking about is the idea of farther upstream, not ever bringing something into the system. And, that long-term vision of having community supports that you can look to, that is not a new idea. It's a very old idea, that you have, community groups that can respond directly and support people through that type of response. In terms of your question of, or your comment that people don't report crimes, that is something I hear more and more. And it's something I share with people when they are reluctant or outright opposed to any sort of change. It's an example of the traditional system failing people, not failing crime victims, which is typically the system. When it defends itself, typically defends itself in the name of crime victims. And I think one of the most powerful counters to that is typically helping people to understand how much we fail people who are who have been the source of some sort of crime, have had something happen to them, whether that's a property crime, whether it's a community-based crime, or whether it's a person crime, and how deeply we aren't meeting so many of their needs, not everybody's needs, but so many of those people's needs. And if we are doing this in that sort of community well-being name, we need to be honest and recognize where we are serving people and where we aren't serving people. So Amy, you're not the only person who says that. And I think, I live in St. Paul. I always start conversations with people about that too. I am a member of this community. We do need to have better responses right at the front so that people who have already experienced some harm or violence aren't worried about either perpetuating that against others in some sort of punishment or retribution, or in an escalation situation. So that you are not alone. I agree that we need different responses.
And I call the police when I need them. I'm going to tell you the truth. I call them when I need them. I'm a single parent. I live in the city. If I need them, I do call them, but I try first. I try to reach out first. There's kind of, sometimes no getting around some things, so I call them when I need them.
So we're almost out of time, but I want to lift up a question from Father Harry Berry, who is actually the founder of Twin Cities Nonviolent, which is part of how this panel was advertised. He asks, and I think this circles back around to something that you said at the beginning, Brenda, how do we change our cultural norm that the best way to prevent wrongdoing is by punishment? How do we change that norm?
I think this is something that we have to examine within ourselves. I think we have to look at the way we have looked at punishment. And sometimes we think the harsher it is, that it will deter behavior. We have to really examine where that comes from. Where did all of that start? When did we start to begin to think that works? And then, we have to look at some of the data that shows that it's not working. Right? We've had somewhere between 60 and 100 years of this kind of system, and it hasn't worked. It's ended us up with a bigger problem. So we need to look at what does work and what doesn't work. We need to look at the data too. But how we change that cultural norm is one person at a time. I think first we examine our own thoughts, and I think we practice differently. We don't continue to punish people. We don't continue just to inflict pain, hoping that it will deter behavior. And, we will come to a happy medium that says, what, maybe if we meet people's needs, maybe if we sit down and have the conversation, we can start to do this differently. So I think it starts within your own heart and mind. That's one of the shifts that we try to make, from crime and punishment to harm and needs, thinking of it differently, treating it differently, approaching it differently. And I think that's what we've done through this program, Reimagining Justice for Youth.
And on that note, I want to say thank you both to all three of you, to Brenda, to Annie, and to Randy, and to all of you who came today. I'm so grateful that you could be part of this, and look for more information about restorative justice, more ways to get involved. We are happy to keep sharing out the info. So maybe, we can't really, I suppose we could unmute and applause, but anyway, thank you. Thank you all so much.